Hi everyone.
Hello.
Are you all sorry? Just waiting on Chantel. Okay, I think everybody's here, so we'll get started. So hello everyone, a very warm welcome to you all. This is African Solutions, and African Solutions is a Tigray Youth Network initiative that brings together activists, community leaders, people of influence from across Africa and the diaspora in dialogue and solidarity. This session of African Solutions commemorates the 200th day of the ongoing Tigray genocide, although today is day 211. And our title today is African Solutions, How We Are Failing Women and Girls in Conflict. Our panelists will address the African Union's shortcomings, community healing, and the need for solidarity within various grassroots movements, as well as propose action measures. The conversation today will focus on current and past challenges of the African continent, as well as Africans and African diaspora and our allies, what we can do to support transformational justice and peace. So many of you may not know about what's been going on in the north of Ethiopia, Tigray. So before we continue, I'll just run through a bit about what's going on in Ethiopia. So it's been like one of the most devastating wars on the continent. And you know, maybe Ethiopia runs, or at least used to run, on an ethnic federalism system. This uses ethnic groups as units of self-government, and it was set up to take into account the voices of minorities and prevent minority subjugation. This was ran under the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, a party that was made up of a coalition of various different ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And the EPRDF was allowed to form under after various revolution fronts fought to tear down the Red Terror, a very brutal regime before the last one that was responsible for the death of more than 1 million people. Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, took a major role in this fight for revolution. The current regime in Ethiopia was born out of the collapse of EPRDF. In June 2020, this time last year, Ethiopia was due a national election, which was supposedly postponed by the unelected Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed due to concerns over coronavirus. It's important to highlight that Ethiopia still has not had elections, and the elections continue to be postponed. The TPLF saw this government's reason to postpone the elections as false, and they saw it as a reason for as a way of him lengthening his stay in power. So they ran their own elections, which an overwhelming number of Tigrayans took a part of. The TPLF won with a large majority out of the 5 opposing parties that took part in this election. After this election, both governments, both the regional and the central government, stopped recognizing each other. And the central government saw that the TPLF, what the TPLF did in exercising their rights to self-determine, as defiant and unconstitutional. There was a lot of tension and talks of war the past couple of years, and many politicians, political oppositions of these groups and religious leaders that have since been imprisoned, called for mediation and political dialogue, including the TPLF. The unelected Prime Minister still refuses to cooperate to this day and often uses sovereignty as an excuse. The genocidal war in Tigray has been systematically engineered for years, not just since November. And before it became a war with actual bombs and guns, the current regime has enacted various inhumane ways to weaken the Tigrayan people. For example, obstructing aid to combat that was sent to combat the locust outbreak, which a lot of the East African countries suffered from, and prevented personal protective equipment for coronavirus from going in, and blocked roads to the region, which I actually experienced when I was there. So since the 4th of November 2020, Tigray has faced bombardments, attacks from regional, national, and international military bodies. The Ethiopian government has called this a law enforcement operation against the TPLF, but the stories are contrary to the ground. The war is being fought in the dark, and so there's been communication blackout since November for a lot of the Tigrayan cities, and independent journalists have been barred, internal journalists have been intimidated or even killed, and there is no or limited access to water, electricity, and banks. Tigray is completely under siege, with a population of approximately 7 million people. The war in Tigray has reportedly killed around 150,000 people and internally displaced 2.2 million. Currently, over 60,000 refugees have arrived in Sudan. Almost a third of that refugee population are children. And we know that that number could be more because people are being prevented from crossing over to Sudan to seek protection. Genocide is being conducted through weaponized starvation, rape, and in addition, they've been ransacking healthcare facilities, mass killings, war crimes, and this all at the hands of Eritrean, Ethiopian, and Amhara militia. The Ethiopian government continually disregards the international community's call to stop what's happening, and it's causing massive concerns for everybody. Now, I think we should move on to our panelists. It's important to mention from this conversation, we shouldn't expect answers. It's just the beginning of many necessary discussions. And more importantly, it's a time for us to listen and learn from each other. So up first, we have Chantal. Chantal, if you're here. Chantal holds a master's in human rights, gender and conflict studies. She has had like 15 years experience working with different civil society organizations at different levels. She has expertise in sexual and reproductive justice, economic justice, feminist leadership, movement building, knowledge production, writing, policy design, and implementation and advocacy. Thank you for coming on, Chantal. So as we know, Ethiopia has been labeled stage 9 on the genocide watch, which is extermination. And since we've seen that African solutions have not been, solutions, like providing solutions for us as Tigrayans, maybe more so being complicit in the genocide. So Chantal, yourself, as a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, with all your expertise on justice, what was your experience with African solutions? Chantal, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be part of these discussions, and I also want to ask that you allow me to switch off my video to allow the internet to be a little bit more stable so that I can continue.
It's okay. It's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. So like I was saying, and like you introduced me, yes, I am a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda against the Tutsis. And currently I'm a feminist activist focusing on different social justice issues, among which also includes activities and advocacy around peace building and conflict mitigation, working closely with the African Union and different networks. So the question you ask is very, very critical. And in the context of Rwanda, it's up to this time, I think we're still learning and unlearning about what really happened and what could do better as a country, but as a continent in general. So as we all know, Africa is divided, and the divisions were really made worse by the colonial era. What happened in Rwanda was also not very did not happen in vacuum or in separation of the colonial history, and indeed it was part of that, and to a great extent of the colonial history, that the divisions or the context that existed in Rwanda that was never seen or was never highlighted as problematic was based on to really entrench and have the divide and rule approach of colonial era to succeed. But it's something that went beyond the colonial era that also got entrenched into the Rwandan community. So and so what we saw in 1994 was just the climax or the consequence of many years of planning and putting into practice the genocide plan. So like in all the contexts where we have had conflicts and genocides, it is evident that most of the time women and girls get affected, like maybe some of my colleagues are going to speak on. In Rwanda as well, women were used as a weapon of war, and what Rwanda was, I don't think to ever be the same again, but we had to pick the pieces and find a way to forge a way forward. I lost all my parents in the genocide. I lost my like 90% of my relatives in the genocide, and that makes me part of who I am and what I work on today as an activist for social justice. And so, yeah, today when we talk about the post-genocide Rwanda, when we're now talking about the Africa solutions, all these kind of questions come to my mind about what we're really talking about and what we have learned from the Rwandan context. So yes, like I said, like I started off saying, Africa is divided, and those divisions, even way post the colonial era, are still existing up to today, alongside language, alongside culture, context, and everything. And also alongside what we call now development, where funding or support or any kind of cooperations with either be it pre-colonial states or the new partnerships, they are still to a large extent making these divisions worse, that make it really hard to have a comprehensive and realistic Africa solutions approach to what we're talking about today. So for instance, we can talk about the more recent case in Rwanda, where it's been more than 28 years, where one of the leading and perpetrators and the master plan of the genocide, Mr. Felicien Kabuga, was captured after all these years. And if you make a list of all the different countries in Africa that have worked with him, that have hidden him, that have supported him to travel from country to country, there are very many of them. So you ask yourself, why? Why do we talk about Africa solutions? But in practice, we also have states and leaders that at the same time, when it comes to putting these things in practice, we stay silent, or we just close our ears and don't want to listen, or to act and do things that we commit to. We can talk about different ways about how Rwanda has really managed to get out of this. I don't think it is Africa solutions. We had to also, go back to the same people that supported the genocide for help, for support, because we don't have that. We don't have those kind of partnerships and support, and like what they usually call the South-South cooperation, that Africa solutions can come from ourselves. So we still have those issues of dependency that are made worse daily by the partnerships or the choices that African leaders choose to do. So if you consider what is happening today in Ethiopia and with the Tigray massacres, that's where you really see that we have not learned a lot in terms of what has happened on the continent and still is happening in different contexts, it really shows that we have a long way to go to ensure that what we talk about, we have to put in practice in terms of conflict mitigation and solutions. And it is really interesting that, for instance, that we're having these discussions that, like you said, the beginning, but we did not have this kind of discussions pre-Rwandan genocide. There were not much awareness about what was going on. So at least I do see hope in terms of how people are trying to organize now, especially young people, in terms of awareness raising about things that are going on in the continent and how together we can really play different roles to continue holding our leaders accountable on the African continent to walk the talk when they say Africa solution. So for now, I'm going to stop here. If there will be more further questions or comments, I'll be happy to contribute to this discussion. But thank you again.
And thank you, Shuvai. As you said, because of a lack of these type of conversations or actual initiatives put into action, in Rwanda, they lost 40% of the Rwandan population and over 1 million people in less than 100, in 100 days. So we need to have these conversations. And as Chantal just said, if anybody that's in the Zoom, please do ask us any questions you have throughout the discussion. Okay, so next I'll go to Dr. Olajumoke, and she has studied the positions of women in conflict and post-conflict situations in Africa, with a particular focus on refugees and displacement concerns. She has conducted extensive fieldwork in Liberia, some in Nigeria and Geneva. She's also researched border issues in relation to the comparative politics of African states. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Doctor. I know you've specialized in displacement, refugees, and the displacement of refugees is not by chance, it's actually deliberate. And with this conflict, we've seen around 2.2 million people be internally displaced, and the 60,000 refugees that have fled into Sudan. So my question for you is, what do women tend to face in conflict as opposed to their male counterparts, and what implications does the creation of refugees have on women and girls in conflict? And then what solutions have African solutions had from what you have learned?
All right, thank you so much, Rita. And I think it's a privilege to be on this panel. Thank you for inviting me, and I commend the work that the Tigray Youth Network is doing in promoting conversation on these very important issues, and as a path to both assessing where we are and where we need to be going towards solutions. Absolutely. Let me also take permission to keep my video off because my internet has been unstable, and I hope you can hear me, and I'll just speak quickly to your questions. The first question you posed is in terms of women's experiences in conflict generally, which means you want me to situate this conversation perhaps in a broader context, and so that we do not see what is happening to women and others in the Tigray Ethiopian conflict as completely new. Because once we understand that this is a pattern, that these are expected patterns and outcomes of conflicts, then we also understand that the solutions are also not novel. And whenever they are not being applied, we have to ask why. Because if they are not new problems, then solutions may not be new. But let me just quickly give that broader context in terms of women's experiences. And I just want to make three quick general statements about this. The first is that, yes, women experience conflicts differently from men and others. And when we recognize that, then we'll pay attention to the gendered impacts of war, as well as the gendered impacts of peacemaking and peacekeeping and peace enforcement and all the paraphernalia of making peace are very different and gendered and have different impacts on men, women, and others in society. And this is as a result of two things: their sex, the biological characteristics, which means that what happens to a man's physical body during war is different from what happens to a woman's physical body and the impacts that that can have. And the second reason why this is different is because of their gender in terms of society's definition of femininity and of masculinity and the expectations that come from being male or female. These are the reasons why men and women would experience conflict in different ways. In terms of their sex, their physical characteristics, it is because when men are raped, they cannot be pregnant, even though they can also be, they will be traumatized. And so you see, there are these different outcomes. And men are raped, that is very true, but in far lesser numbers. And women are raped in far higher numbers during conflict because women are seen as the cultural bearers of nationality, of ethnic identity, of the future of a community. And so they are targeted in a way that men may not be targeted. So these are the way, some of the reasons why men and women experience conflicts differently. The second main point I want to make is that the experiences of men and women being different in conflict, especially as we want to focus on women and girls in this discussion, must be situated in a longer trajectory of societal violence against women and girls. In other words, the violence that girls and women experience in conflict is not new to them. It is a continuation of violence that they experience in their everyday lives, violence that pervades their everyday interactions, their everyday existence. What happens during conflict is that this violence becomes concentrated, becomes amplified, becomes more overt, whereas perhaps it was more covert, more hidden in non-conflict situations. So actually violence is a continuum for women and girls. And in conflict, it becomes more obvious and, as I said, perhaps more deadly than. So this is to say, again, that what conflict does is to exacerbate, to bring to the forefront underlying prejudices and discriminations that already affects women and girls in society. In conflict, it's out there. You can obviously see that girls and women have, and I'm deliberately saying women and girls, because a lot of times also, I think that we also forget that age is a fundamental, has a fundamental impact on how people experience conflicts, so to speak. And one case in point is the recent the recent case at the ICC of the Ugandan warlord, the Lord's Resistance Army rebel, who, of course, his crimes were proven, but because he was a child soldier, the decision of the courts was to soften the repercussions. That's to say that being a child in conflict has specific implications that we need to take into consideration. So women and girls have possibly different and related stories to tell. So I'm just amplifying that sense from the period that there was no war to the period of conflict. And then we must know, and this is the most important part, that that violence persists beyond the end, the formal end of conflict. And whoever is looking, whatever parties, whatever actors may be involved in looking for solutions, they must plan to manage and to attenuate the violence that continues in the so-called post-conflict era, because it will continue unless specifically understood and addressed. I hope you're still with me. I want to make the third point.
Yeah.
My screen is frozen, so I need to know if you're hearing me.
We can hear you, Ola.
Thank you very much. The third point I want to make is that the experiences of women in conflict, including the Tigray conflict, which I have followed from the first day, is that, of course, even amongst women, there are differences of ethnicity, of class, of geographical location, whether they're in the urban or rural areas, or whether they are close to political headquarters, or whether they are distant from it, whether they are close to borders, or whether they are far from borders. There are differences of class. Poor women usually have not just limited resources, but limited networks to also find independent solutions during conflict. So whereas conflict may spark, and women with more resources and networks can immediately get on a plane and look for asylum somewhere, or go to their second home in Dubai or in the UK or in the United States, poorer women are impacted differently because they do not have these options. And so if they are close to a border, they cross a border if they are allowed. In this case, there are, of course, allegations that even people are being prevented from accessing refugee camps, and that's a possibility. So there are these, what we call intersectionalities, questions of identities that shape how women experience, different women experience conflict, as we would see in this situation. But intersectionality is not just about women's identity, it's also about this global structure that frames our lives, even more so as Africans, as products of colonialism, of imperialism, of autocratic government, of globalization, of the Washington Consensus, of so many global structural issues that restrict the options that we have for finding issues that affect refugees and refugee women also, because all these factors I have spoken about are also exactly what refugee women face. The only difference for refugee women is that they cross a border, but in this case, as you can see, the number of displaced in the country itself far exceeds the number that is able to cross a border. So internally displaced persons are in a situation in which the conflict is being foisted by the government on them, and at the same time, they are at the mercy of that same government for their survival and for their daily needs. And so this makes them, this puts them in a very helpless situation, in a situation in which their agency is very severe. Again, will have to do with working with the government that may also be the one that has put them in that same situation. So this is a very tricky and very complicated situation that IDPs, internally displaced persons, tend to face. And lastly, so that we can discuss later, I think you asked about solutions that Africa has had, and I'll just, because this whole panel is about solutions, so we'll come back to this, but just to say that the challenge that we've had in Africa has not been one of Africans not understanding their responsibility to women, to girls, or to refugees, because there are these treaties, there are these laws, conventions, agreements, institutions of all sorts that we have agreed and set up. But frankly speaking, in this particular Tigrayan conflict, it seems that nothing has been deployed to do anything other than some lip service, appointment of envoys to go and do what we don't know. And I think the problem is political. Ethiopia is hosting the African Union. You cannot make your host uncomfortable, and that's problematic. And in our African settings, this question of hospitality to your guests and to your hosts is taken entirely out of proportions. And when we talk about African solutions to African problems, I am all for African solutions to African problems. But we also know, as Chantal spoke about their own experience in Rwanda, we also know that this same mantra has been used to shield African governments from responsibility and from answering for the crimes or for the crimes they have committed against their own people, so to speak. And so, in my opinion, and if we look at the way that this Ethiopia has handled this, it has told basically everybody to stand back and leave us alone. It's an internal affair. And for me, that means that as Africans, we must examine again the concept of territorial integrity and sovereignty when it has to do with responsibility to protect persons. Africa has led the rest of the world in thinking this way. And I think with reference to the Tigrayan conflict, we have to bring that to bear again. What responsibilities do we have to the people that are impacted by this conflict that will transcend the principles of sovereignty, of non-interference in internal affairs of states, and all those other principles that governments hide under. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you so much, Ola, and thank you so much for your insights. Yeah, so I always make the point that women, when in conflict, are always fighting for double emancipation, revolting against fascists, but then revolting also as women because of their gender. But now I think we have a third, which is them as Africans, as these states neglect them completely. The Human Rights UN chief, Mark Lowcock, spoke about the genocidal rape that happened on the ground, and stated that the rapes are deliberately, systematically organized, targeted, ethnically based, and are intended to terrorize, humiliate, and brutalize the women. And yeah, as you said, the AU, African Union, has lots of initiatives, and one of them is Silence the Gun. And these romantic phrases don't mean anything to Africans unless they're actually implemented. But we'll go into the actual solutions a bit later. Next, we'll have Shuvai, who is currently the executive director of the African Leadership Center. Prior to joining the center, Shuvai worked as the director of interventions, and before that, the regional advocacy specialist for the Center of Study of Violence and Reconciliation in Johannesburg, South Africa. She's worked extensively with a range of regional and national policymakers, civil society actors, and academics in post-conflict and transitional countries on the African continent. Thank you so much for joining us, Shuvai. Now, I think I can speak for most Tigrayans, at least when I say I don't think we're at the point where reconciliation can happen. The genocidal war is still happening in the most cruel ways, and I don't believe it's possible to actually grasp the gravity of the situation that's happening right now. But as difficult as it is, reconciliation is something that will have to happen at some point in the future. So Shuvai, my question to you is, what have been your takeaways from all these years of work on dealing with reconciliation and post-conflict nations, and what have African solutions looked like so far to you, especially in terms of women and girls?
Thank you. Thank you. I think I join my fellow panelists in just in my appreciation for the opportunity and the invitation to be part of this conversation. I think when I first encountered or received the invitation, I was just really impressed by the initiative being taken by young people, by young Africans, to reach out beyond your own situation and look to the rest of the continent and establish that kind of solidarity, even in terms of looking forward and thinking about the future. And I think this is really important, even when we think about a question like reconciliation or a post-conflict setting, right? Because the solutions, I think, as Jumoke said, these are not new problems, they're not new challenges, and some of the solutions already exist. But as young people, as the future, as those who will make decisions in the future, there are a lot of things to think about, and this is one of them. I think I have three kind of sets of responses, and hopefully I won't take too long as I make these points to respond to your questions. So the first one is, in terms of what I've taken away from my work in reconciliation or working in post-conflict settings, the first one is to look at African societies for what and how they are, and not what we think they ought to be. So if you're a scholar, not what the theories and the conceptual frameworks tell you that African societies ought to be, and not what the policies that we adopt wholesale from, both Chantal and Jumoke have spoken about, the role of colonialism and our colonial past. So not what the colonial idea has been about what our societies should be like. And also to look at what resources exist in a situation and how they work. The second set of points is around the role of terms, terminology, and language. And then the final thing I'll talk about is some of these solutions and some of what I've seen. In terms of looking at our societies for what they are and not what they ought to be, one of the things I've taken away or observed is that African societies are by nature entities that seek to live harmoniously or with some semblance of balance. So like you said, right now may not be the time to start talking about reconciliation, but there is the sense that our societies are ones where we are constantly trying to look for how we coexist with our neighbors, etc. So we exist in ecosystems where there are numerous moving parts, and both my fellow panelists have spoken about this. And there are established understandings of how these parts work together, whether this is positive or negative, right? So we have notions of Utu or Ubuntu, right? I am because you are. And this is expressed by our societies all across the continent, especially even in situations where people are experiencing conflict or crisis or rupture. And even where people are not, and I've experienced this as well, where people will relate to me when I enter into a space, because they may not be excited about what I'm doing if I'm coming to document violations, for instance, but there is an affinity established because I'm an African, and maybe because I'm a woman, and they acknowledge, and I'm acknowledging their Africanness and their humanity, and I empathize in one way or another with their situation, right? And then also that when these societies or these ecosystems don't work harmoniously, we do have methods and ways of establishing balance. So even like you say, it may not be the time now to start talking about reconciliation, but it may be time to think about it, right? So what are the ways in the context to begin thinking about re-establishing balance? I had an experience once. I was interviewing and collecting statements from women survivors of sexual violence and conflict in South Sudan, and one particular young mother, spoke to me. I went in there asking questions, because this was a rights-based kind of documentation process, trying to find out, what her desire for justice and accountability was. And she simply said to me how immediately following her experience, what was most important to her was the ability to breastfeed her child. Now, after what she had physically gone through, the cultural kind of context did not allow for her to do that unless she had been through a particular process, right? And that included finding an elder in the community, finding a goat that could be slaughtered in order to perform some kind of practice so that it would restore her to being able to continue her role as a mother and the survival of her child. So the point here, and I'm saying this as a takeaway, is that when things don't work together harmoniously, our societies are continually trying to find ways to bring back that balance. And those are some of the things we need to be understanding. So what knowledge exists about how we can establish that balance. The second set of things that I wanted to talk about is the role of terms, of terminology, of language. So, whose terminology, whose language is it that we're using in trying to understand our context of crisis or conflict? Why do we accept it, right? So what is reconciliation? Whose reconciliation? What is a post-conflict setting? When did it become pre-conflict? Who decided it was conflictual or non-conflictual, etc.? What are we reconciling? What and whom? Why? How? On whose terms? If we're saying we're reconciling, what is it we're returning to, right? And what are we missing out? So then another question then becomes, what room for new and different and acknowledging the society or the world that we live in is there in these processes that we're calling reconciliation? How dynamic is it? How has the current situation shifted? And how has it been influenced and by whom? And I think Jumoke spoke about all these global processes that we need to take into account. So for example, many of you who are part of the Tigray Youth Network are diasporans. You're living in a country that is either not your own. Some of you may have been born in the country where you are. You may be very dislocated from this place that you call home. And even in as much as there may be affinity with those who are living there now or those who have been affected or even displaced, there are also differences. Jumoke spoke about the intersectionality, right? The differences amongst not only women and girls, but just amongst people who may claim a particular identity. So it's important for us, even as we begin to think about what reconciliation may look like, to begin to think through terms, terminology, language, how we use it. Does reconciliation to you sitting in Europe or the United States mean the same thing as a Tigrayan sitting in a refugee settlement or even still within Ethiopia? Then in terms of African solutions and what these have looked like so far, for me, I think these are things that exist, but we don't often think of as solutions. So the first one is African solutions in these contexts have largely entailed dialogue, listening, talking, creating and providing space and allowing for various people to engage in that space. So whether they're insiders, so those most affected, or whether they're external people, maybe international actors, it means allowing ideas and language into a space and to make contribution. And for example, and we have many examples where this has taken place, where it has involved these kinds of, talking, dialogue, etc. So if we think about Gachacha in Rwanda, if we think about engaging the Magamba spirits in Mozambique, if we think about Macho Put in northern Uganda, all processes to have conversation, to provide space for people who have been affected and people who have perpetrated violations to be in the same space and agree on a way for moving forward and moving together. The second thing around solutions is that it's involved time. And so that's why I appreciate what you said at the very beginning, that now may not be the time to start talking about it, but maybe the time to start thinking about reconciliation. So it's involved time, both long time or long term and short term, and realizing and accepting that some things happen in the now and others may happen a very long time after, right? But these things and these processes are still very linked. So the immediate processes and the much later processes, like Chantel gave us an example of, are still very linked. So for example, in Zimbabwe, the country that I come from, we now are beginning to have conversations about events that took place almost 40 years ago. In South Africa, they had a truth and reconciliation process alongside the independence and liberation process. In Mozambique, now we see questions that came up in the previous conflict coming up in the conflict that's currently happening. In South Sudan, this is something that is currently unfolding. So these processes are also then linked and tied together by a number of things that revolve around knowledge, data, and information. So it could be factual information about what happened, when, who, the numbers of those affected, statistics, geo data, geolocation data, spatial data, right? It could also involve memory, right? So memory of various people that remember things in different ways and not in the same way, even within the same household. A husband and a wife who may have witnessed the same thing may not remember something in the same way. It happens it's narrated in different languages, right? And also memory that fades over time. It's also linked through stories that are told by certain voices, whether it's the media, social media, international media, local media, national media, regional media. It's told for different reasons, right? To share, to evoke emotion, to distort even the facts of something that may have happened. And so this is all part of these processes, which are solutions. And then lastly, African people, and one of the solutions has been African people and institutions taking leadership. I know in this particular context, we've heard from Jumoke that there hasn't been sufficient, we haven't seen sufficient leadership being taken, which is why I think such an initiative by young people is really important, and it is part of taking leadership. But we see in these situations leadership emerging. And my challenge to you all is, where the leadership has not emerged from the quarters where we would expect it to, what is it that not only yourselves as Tigrayan Youth Network, but other young people can do by way of taking leadership? But we do see that institutions, people, individuals take leadership, and this is through thought leadership in terms of research, documentation, fact-finding, and bringing to bear and testing some of the African norms and values. Again, Jumoke spoke about some of these, but there are questions around how can ordinary people use some of the instruments that exist at a continental level, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Charter on Democracy and Good Governance, and some of the other institutions. How do you make use of solidarity networks across the continent, the Pan-African movement, in order to bring to bear some of these solutions? So let me leave it at that and can take questions. Thank you. I hope that made sense and was useful.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shuvai. That was excellent. A point you made about data collection and having all of this data to then maybe get justice later on is something that came to mind. And as you may know, I mentioned earlier that we've been in a communication blackout. The capital and a few cities surrounding have been connected on the phone like months into the conflict, but there are still many areas that we've not been able to reach at all. So data collection has been extremely difficult. Just this morning, I spoke to a friend who hasn't spoken to his parents for the last 7 months because of this conflict. And I think a lot of people have the impression that we can connect with the people there now, and this is completely false. Leadership is completely crucial and has been a role, I guess, that we've all had to take on, being in the diaspora and with a position of privilege, to learn about all these things, whether it's advocacy, reaching out to different grassroots movements, having conversations like this. And it's something that we are learning, but we're not experts. But it's a start, and I think it's a start in the right direction. So just in case we run out of time, I think we should move on to the Q&A. A few people have asked questions, and I want to direct the first question sent to me. It was directed to Chantal, if you're here. It's in regards to how you've managed to heal, if so, from the genocide, how you've managed to perhaps forgive, if you have, the perpetrators of such violence on you and your family, and live, coexist with the people that have done this in Rwanda, or with the families of the people who have done it. Can you give us what advice would you give to somebody who may have been in your position, who will be in your position in this period? Chantal, are you with us? Checking. Okay, maybe if we get back to Chantal a bit later, there's another question that was directed to Ola. And a lady asked, what are the non-medical needs of women experiencing sexual violence in conflict? Oh, Chantal's back. I'm sorry. Should we go? It's Chantal.
Yeah.
Can you hear us? Yeah.
So,
Sorry, Ola, we'll get back to you.
Internet issue. Kindly, can you help me repeat the question?
Yes, of course. So the question was in relation to your experience, how have you dealt and healed from the pain, I guess, the perpetrators of all this violence put on you and your family, and how have you been able to coexist with all of these people, the families of these perpetrators, and what advice would you give to somebody who is in your position, was in your position?
Thank you so much. Let me just start by saying that personally, and also basing on experiences of close people that I have one sister, older sister, that survived together with me. I have never healed, and I don't think I ever will. Often people do ask this. Sometimes there's an assumption that after some time, after working on ABCD, maybe you get to a point where you are healed. But the healing, I don't think I've ever healed, and I don't think I ever will. But what has been more important in terms of coping mechanisms and all that is to really find a way to live with me, or who I am, or the people that I support in my family and all that. Finding ways to learn and unlearn, because like up to this time, I have different views and perspectives from those of my sister regarding the genocide. She has different ways of looking at it that sometimes are not the same way that I look at it. But for me, I would say growing up, learning and understanding issues around not only Rwandan genocide, but in general conflicts and the different factors, and like things like genocides and how they happen, and the different roles and actors that different institutions and people play. It really did help me to kind of cope better, because unlike for unlike for most of my family members, they still live in a situation where they put the blame and direct pain on the people that cause a direct harm to us. They still put the blame on people that destroyed our house, that did the actual killing and all that. Well, I do understand that for some people that's also something that they have to deal with, but also understanding the broader image of this, and really where we should focus our energy in terms of learning and finding ways to work with this. And one of the things that for me works for me is, for example, working on these issues. And what gives me hope, like one of the questions asked, is being able to feel like I am now trying to share my experience in a way that is positive, in a way that hopefully can help other people not go through what I've done through, in a way that can help people learn. I've been struggling for many years about how can I actually go through this in a way that is helpful. And I've also been trying to decide if how I want to share my story. And eventually, I think it was last year that I finally decided that I'm going to write a book. My sister could not believe it, because she says, you are only 8 years old during the genocide. What do you remember? But it's not so much about how much I remember, but it is how I experienced it at that age, and what are my perspectives now. So what I experienced, even though I was 8 years old, is still valid, and something that I want to share still with the world, in terms of for people to learn and see how different people and how there are different perspectives in terms of like coping, but also learning and unlearning these things that we're talking about. So it's work in progress, but I think the most important thing is to understand how you can find a way to live and to cope with the life as you have it now, in a way that can also provide hope for others, or at least if you can help prevent similar situations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Thank you for your bravery in sharing your experience in this in order to help Tigrayans and people that are going through a similar thing. Okay, so up next, we said we'd ask Ola the question of what are the non-medical needs of women experiencing sexual violence. Just before you answer that question, I want to highlight that the UN Population Fund estimates that there will be about 52,500 Tigrayan sexual violence survivors, and there are countless reports of that coming out. One of them is a story of a 27-year-old Marhawit who was separated from her sister and locked in a room with only a thin, dirty mattress for 2 weeks. She said the Eritrean troops that have entered in Tigray and have been very active in this genocide gang raped her repeatedly, fracturing her spine, pelvis, and leaving her crippled on the ground for days. So with this in mind, what are the non-medical needs of women like Marhawit? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a very difficult story to hear, and it's just hard to imagine that there are thousands of these experiences right now. The medical needs are urgent, and I think we all agree on that. And one thing I have found out in meeting women after conflict, usually, most of my research has been with women at the end of conflict. I don't like saying that, because I often say that conflict never ends for women, even though there is a peace agreement somewhere, so to say. But one thing I've noticed is that the psychosocial needs are often not planned for, not programmed for, and overlooked. And so the psychosocial impacts, while the physical body is treated, often the mind, the mind is left to grapple with the experiences, as the case may be. So in some ways, that's a medical intervention, but it's also not completely medical and requires also expert intervention. But more other needs that sexual violence victims or survivors may have are social. The question of reintegrating them, reconciling them to their families, having their families accept them back as members, because we know that in many African societies, the experience of sexual violence ostracizes you from your family and from your community. So you're thinking of reintegration needs, you're thinking of reconciliation, you're thinking of programs that deal with the stigma attached to sexual violence. And these are social interventions that must be planned for. Economic remedies must also be provided in two ways. A lot of times, take the example of the experience you just narrated. A lot of times there are disabling consequences of sexual violence, which means that a person's ability to gain employment or to create a source of livelihood is significantly affected. So this must also be addressed consciously if we want a person who has received medical attention to be able to live some semblance of a normal life again. So we must provide livelihood opportunities for them, and there must be political redress. And I think this may be Shuvai's particular expertise, but there must be acknowledgement, not just that war had impact, but that there was sexual violence specifically, and that certain persons and individuals or groups were particularly affected in specific ways. The best, perhaps one of the best ways to acknowledge and to do this is to have a truth commission that documents these incidences and makes it a part of the national history and narrative for posterity. And so it does not become a question of what you remembered may not be actually right or wrong. There must be a national record of these atrocities. And of course, there must be there must be some form of compensation, reparations that makes it possible for these persons in the short term and in the long term to feel like their suffering has been seen, acknowledged, not compensated in the real world of it, but actually at least taken seriously. And this can come in so many ways. And of course, lastly, justice for the perpetrators is a political act that must be planned and must be. Justice, of course, we know can take so many different forms. It may be punishment, it may be whatever that society agrees on, but there must be justice. And what that justice is must be discussed and implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. Yeah, you spoke about the taking on that there were perpetrators of rapes, whether it's rapes or killings or whatever it is, and them taking that on and saying, you know, them or the society as a whole, this group have done this, and beginning reconciliation in that sense. We know for the Tigrayans that it's not, especially the rape against the women, is not random, and some sort of, you know, just a sick moment of whatever. It's not random, it's completely systematic, it's happening in a genocidal way. It's genocidal rape. Naima of CNN talked about a Tigrayan rape survivor, and she said she was raped repeatedly by Ethiopian soldiers. She was told that her blood was being purified, she was being made Amharanized, and this whole thing was about erasing Tigray and the Tigrayan identity and the Tigrayan bloodline, and that these are the hallmarks of genocide. So, okay, going from there, do you have anything to contribute in this, Shuvai? As Ola said, it's your.
Thanks, thank you. And I think, like Olajumoke said, that I mean these examples, these stories are always very difficult to hear. And one of the things, and I want to link it to a question that I saw in the Q&A about the responses and reactions of other Africans and why Africans have not been as outspoken about Tigray as they were, for instance, about Palestine. This is not new, right? So even what you describe in terms of this particular violation is not new, and I think Olajumoke made this point already. And you know, from across conflicts on our continent, we do see the bodies of women, especially, but also of men, used as the terrain on which conflict is acted, right? So a human body is not just a human body in terms of which group a person belongs to, but the human body is also part of a conflict that is taking place. And I think it's important for us to, while we acknowledge and understand the significance of what is taking place, and we're not making excuses that this should be happening, no, not at all. But also if we put it in context and understand that this has been, this is not new, right? So I spoke about Zimbabwe earlier, I spoke about Mozambique, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Northern Uganda. We have countless examples. I mean, yesterday, Kenya celebrated Madaraka Day, which is essentially Independence Day. And even in Kenya's struggle for independence, sexual violence was a central part of the way the conflict was played out. So I think what is important is, and then the example you gave, that this was something a journalist for CNN, an international media house, was using as an example. I think what is important for us as we think through African solutions is how we take charge of the narrative, right? How we create, develop language, terminology that does not perpetrate or perpetuate some of the ways in which our situations as Africans are described. I often refer to it as human rights pornography, right? So the worst story, the most gruesome act that we can find is what we put out there, and it doesn't do much for the dignity and the situation of the people and the victims, the survivors who are involved, right? So we have so much work to do to take control of the narrative and how that is told. And I'm not saying to downplay it and to deny that things are happening, but how do we use this information? How do we interact with the knowledge production machinery? Because there is a knowledge production machinery. There are people who, you said, yes, that it's difficult for ordinary Tigrayans to go into the area or to even know what's happening. But I guarantee you there are organizations who are collecting information and will have data on the things that are happening. And it will not be data or information that Africans or ordinary Ethiopians, Tigrayans will have that they're able to use for whatever processes at a later date. So in the same way, and to answer the question that was in the chat about how do you get other Africans to, it's about how do you package the story, the narrative in a way that has resonance with other Africans, with other contexts and what may be happening there. So building solidarity around some of these things. I hope I've answered.
Definitely. I think, you've answered that really well. And it goes on to the next part, which is solutions. But before we go there, I just wanted to ask you one question from the Q&A as well. It says, how often, so it says dialogue, and to an extent civil disobedience have been strategies used to affect changes and correct for existing injustices. How often have these strategies been successful in the real world, and how long have they often taken? He says he asked this because of a number of post-colonial African governments mostly communicate and understand and respond in a language of violence. Sorry. So if you can touch on that, and then we'll move on to the next section. Sorry.
You want me to respond to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. I think this is a brilliant question, and that's a brilliant observation. I mean, I've often talked about how yes, governments do understand violence as it's one of our languages, right? It's one of the languages that is used, that people use, etc. And I think, as I was talking earlier about the kind of ecosystem that our African societies are, where we have many of these moving parts, where also violence is one of those moving parts. And I think civil disobedience or protests, they are forms of society expressing their desire for change. But I think the fundamental question for me is how you establish mutuality in a society, how the governed and the governors, or the leaders and the followers, or the state and the society interact or establish mutuality. And where there is no mutuality often is where there is conflict or crisis. And I think the question that we need to be thinking about is, how do you establish, where is influence being exchanged, right? And how do you ensure that the aspirations, the goals of a society are what those who have the power or who decide, essentially, how are they understanding that, expressing it, and moving towards it? And that's ultimately, I think those are the questions that we're asking. So the success or non-success of civil disobedience or protests, I mean, I can't answer that, but what I can say is that that is a manifestation or an expression. Like I said, what we need to understand our societies for what they are and not what they ought to be. And this is something we must acknowledge is happening in some of our societies and some of our contexts.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think when dialogue and all else fails, I guess that's what people resort to express their contentment and anger towards state. So up next, I think we're in the second half of our meeting. So move on to the solutions. Maybe if I ask the question and then we go one by one to go through what they look like for us. So the question is, what should African solutions look like? And what solutions or suggestions do you offer for us all to collaborate and work together and be aware of each other's problems? Not be next door in Kenya or Sudan or wherever, unaware of what's happening in Ethiopia and so on. Chantel, if you're here, we'll start with you and then we'll continue from there. That's okay.
Hi, if you could give me a minute, if somebody else wants to go before, that would be really helpful.
Yes,
thank you.
Perfect. Olajumoke, do you want to go first and then we'll go? That's okay.
Okay, the question is, what should solutions look like at this point in time? I think to begin with, it's always difficult to make recommendations about solutions when it comes to African conflicts, because the more I think about solutions, the more I just I devolve to one key factor that must be present before there can be a solution. Because oftentimes, as much as civilians want the conflict to end, as much as other civil society actors, other non-governmental actors, international actors may want the conflict to end, the political will of the parties to the conflict is very important in bringing a solution to the conflict. Because as I would say so often, really, that war is entirely politics, and the incidents of war, in order to bring an end to it, must find political solutions. And that may also be my bias as a political scientist, because I see the political in everything. And whereas there are so many things we can do, but do we want to end the conflict? Then this is a political act that must be ended by bringing the actors to some form of, I don't know what we'll call it, ceasefire, truce, whatever it is, but the fighting needs to stop before we can talk of addressing the impacts of the war on civilians, whether refugees or women or men or whoever they may be. So long as the fighting continues, we will not be able to do much, because there will be recurrences of violence that will undo our current efforts, so to speak. So the first thing is to end the violence, and then and to do that as a very neutral actor, as a lover of peace and goodwill, and as a friend of Ethiopians and Tigrayans. I want to call on all actors to consider the lasting impact of war and bring it to an end speedily, and come to an agreement on what that will look like. But having said that, we know that every one of us have a role to play, either as Tigrayan youth convening this roundtable, and Shuvai said it, that leadership is so important because it is signaling not just to fellow Tigrayans and Ethiopians, but also to the international community that there are concerned citizens who are willing to stick out their neck in order to bring peace to their country. I saw this in the record of the peace process that brought an end to conflict in Liberia, which I studied very closely. And that is that throughout the war, 14 years of the war in Liberia, so many non-political, non-governmental actors were actively working for peace throughout that war. Some have told their story, some have not. The well-known stories are those of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, are those of Lema Gbowe, both of whom became Nobel Peace Prize winners. Those are the well-known ones. There are other ones of religious actors, of various community groups that intervened at various points, that created corridors of peace and safety and rejuvenation for people who were affected by war, and so many other actors. There were those in the diaspora, like the Tigrayan Youth Network, who never ceased to lobby governments, to lobby humanitarian actors such as the United Nations, various UN agencies that were on the ground in those conflicts, who never ceased to lobby them, not just to intervene in the conflict, but to pay attention to the atrocities that were being committed against specific groups, to direct attention to questions such as sexual violence affecting particular communities and the remedies that could be applied even as the wars were still raging, who lobbied agencies such as the UN High Commission for Refugees to influence the resources that were made available to refugees both outside the borders and within the borders. As we know, the UNHCR has responsibility not only for refugees beyond the borders, but also for internally displaced persons, and basically to make their work more meaningful for people on the ground. So, and of course, I think any one of us could volunteer actually to be on the ground in terms of providing services, either as medical experts or all kinds of experts that may be needed. The theater of war, unfortunately, is far more than just the clash of weapons, as we have seen. It is a complex social environment that requires a complexity of solutions. And I think the last thing I'll mention is to take this again political, but to take it to the regional level. Neighbors and regional, sub-regional actors have always been influential in bringing conflict to an end in our African environment, either in exacerbating the conflict or in bringing it to an end. And I think that Ethiopia's neighbors need to play that role more consciously. In West Africa, the Economic Community of West African States intervened in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Cote d'Ivoire, currently is part of the process in Mali, in northern Nigeria, and places where there is Islamic terrorism ongoing currently, and so on. So regional, sub-regional actors, let's begin with that. The neighbors and that region must take responsibility for what is happening in their neighborhood. But more especially, and I think Shuvai mentioned this, if we want permanent solutions, and I think it's always worthwhile to talk about permanent solutions, even when the conflict is still raging, we must think in terms of an African region where there are no boundaries to goodwill and intervention to protect civilians. And for me, that is to think in terms of achieving our Pan-African dreams of an Africa where we are responsible, everyone is responsible for everyone else, and not waiting for some other actor that is unwilling to, and usually is also the perpetrator, to bring an end to the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ola, and thank you for standing with us and calling for a ceasefire, which is how you began, and to call on our neighbours to take responsibility and take actions for their neighbours, so that we can work together as Africans to create solutions that are actually beneficial to other Africans. Having said that, I'll go back to Chantel if you're still here, if you're ready.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much.
Would you like a reminder of the question?
No, I have it.
Okay, perfect.
I think the previous speaker has really made great points and talked about almost everything I had in mind, but I'll just add on to that. I talked about earlier about learning, through dialogue, but also through different ways, and about how individually we learn, or as networks, or as groups. And like right now, being here is a process of learning that also contributes in different ways. But mostly I wanted to say that in my learning process on issues around conflict and conflict mitigation and everything, I was also able to learn that conflicts themselves are not an issue. Conflict themselves are not necessarily always negative, and that conflicts can be a way of learning and leading to progress. But here we're talking about violent conflicts that are destructive, that destroy not only communities but environments in different ways. And that's a result that happens when we don't have very comprehensive conflict mitigation and meditation processes. So, and that is an area where at the African level we're still lacking a lot. So the previous speaker talked about how do we engage other actors, talked about the neighbors and all that, and that is really a great point, because sometimes I'm talking about how it is very easy sometimes to superficially look at the leadership, at the current law, and feel like that's where the pressure point, where we need to talk, where we need to put our pressure on everything. But sometimes, like it was in the context of Rwanda, there are multiple actors beyond just the ruling party or the ruling president or anything. And that's why I also wanted to say that, yeah, if it would get to the process of conflict mitigation and mediation, for example, which is something that is needed at this point in the Ethiopian context, but has not been able, it can be impacted by, yes, the political will, but there are also other factors at play that we need to be cautious about. Here, I want to give an example again of how, like, let's say pre-Rwandan genocide, if people had tried, for example, to work this through, the then government, it would not have been very easy, and would not have been enough to really stop the mass killings, because there are also other actors. And here I want to also talk about the role of external states, which could be colonial or pre-colonial states, or the current states that also have sometimes, given on different contexts, that they have benefits or have reasons why they want the conflict to not end, or the violent conflict to not end. So also keep in mind the different actors and the different issues that might be at play in different contexts. It's also important, because just directing our energy and discussion at one direction might not be enough. We need to analyze and do a big analysis of this, and find out how and where we can contribute in terms of discussion, in terms of where mitigation is necessary, who can do that best, and all those kind of efforts. But I think, like I said at the beginning of this meeting, having these dialogues and having these discussions is really key and critical, and we need to keep more going. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Chantal. I think I second that for sure. We do need to have more of these conversations. They're not, they're a part of something bigger. Although it can seem tedious and difficult at first, these are necessary when you look at everything as a whole. And lastly, last but not least, we'll go to Shuvai for your answer on what African solutions should be and how they should look for us.
Thanks so much. There's so many questions in the Q&A box. I was trying to respond to some of them.
Thank you.
All of them, my colleagues Chantel and Olajumoke are probably better versed and better, you know, they're the experts and can answer. I think for me, 3 solutions. The first one, I work, as you said at the beginning, at the African Leadership Center. Our mission and our vision is for a next generation of African leaders who are creating and developing solutions to the continent's peace, security, and development challenges. And so for me, the next generation is at the center of this, right? So the first one is that youth are the future. So young people are the future. Young people are the future, and they're part of the solution. So you need to research and investigate the future, right? What does it look like? Who is part of it? And how do you want to relate to those people who are part of that future that you want to see? So you need to understand the future, and you need to create it, and you create it now. The conditions will never be perfect. Jumoke spoke about, you know, the need for fighting and conflict to end and cease, and that is true and that is correct. It's important, but it may not happen today. It may not happen tomorrow. What do you do in the meantime? You need to imagine the future and research the future and prepare for it. The second thing is that knowledge is critical. So one of the questions in the chat is about what can be done now while while conflict is still going on, the situation is still what it is, there's still armed violence. What can you do now for people there? But so knowledge is critical. So you need to be armed with information about your own situation, and information that as much as possible you are gathering independently, but also information from other sources. You also need to know and have information about similar situations, right? So because Tigray, Ethiopia does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within a continent and alongside other continents, right? Where similar things are happening. And you also need to know your continent and know how to relate to it. So knowledge is critical. Be armed with knowledge. The final thing for me is continue to create spaces. This is a great space. This is a wonderful space, but continue to create spaces, continue to allow them to be transnational, to be transcontinental, to be global in nature. Create spaces with other young Ethiopians, right? This is critical. In as much as there is a very divisive, you know, this conflict is divisive, but create spaces that include others who you may wish to speak to, because like it or not, the future includes you know, other young people who may not be here and may not be in this space. That's all from me for solutions. Thanks.
Thank you, Shuvai. Are there any questions that you've seen you'd like to answer live?
No.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, so for us as Tigrayans and addressing this issue about women, the weaponized and sexual violence on the Tigrayan women and girls have long-term ramifications on the psychological well-being of the survivors, and you know, the trauma and distress they're going to face today and then going forward. Gender-based violence, it's not light, it's coercive control. It includes physical and psychological assault, but it also includes identity politics, and the intent of this genocidal rape is to subjugate and subdue the individual, and it always affects women as more so than men, as you said. And gender-based violence is also reflective of societal behavior. Due to patriarchal society, women are most likely to be victims, as you said earlier, Olajumoke. And so in terms of African solutions, we don't want for African solutions to African problems to be used for the destruction of Africans. We don't want the lip service from our institutions to be used to brutalize and humiliate our women. We want real solutions that actually benefit Africans. Any miscarriage of justice and failure to bring the perpetrators to justice is not only denying closure for the sexual violence victims, but also leaves them with lifetime scars. This is without mentioning the economic hurdles and social stigmatizations that the sexual violence survivors will face and endure for the rest of their lives. So I think we have a bit of time, sorry, to end it on a bit of a heavy note, but we have a bit of time to answer a few of the questions that are being asked. One question was an interesting one. They said, what do you think? Do you think there would be a difference if our leaders were predominantly female throughout Africa? And can I ask that to you, Olajumoke? That's okay.
Would there be a difference if most African heads of states were women? I think the evidence tells us that there would be. And that is not to say at all that women are inherently more peaceful. I'm not going to argue that. But the empirical evidence is that in modern times, female heads of states are far less likely to go to war with anybody than male leaders, male political leaders. That's just the evidence we have. And it may also be because there are so few women anyway, and so there are fewer instances of women political leaders who prosecute wars. Margaret Thatcher went to war with the Falklands, and there are a few examples like that, but they are so far between that we do know that yes, if we open up the political space like Rwanda has done, and we try to include more women in governance. However, the impact is more visible with women in executive positions, actually. So when you have women in executive positions, you're more likely to have that effect than just women in parliament. And this is where it has been difficult for us in Africa to elect and to select female executives, either as heads of state or as cabinet ministers or, decision making and executive positions. It's been really tough to have women in those positions. But if we do, the evidence overwhelmingly is that women leaders are more inclusive in governance. When you are more inclusive, you eliminate some of the causes of conflicts to begin with, and much less going all the way to violent conflict. And there's also the fact that women tend to be more deliberative in government. And again, this evidence is very contemporary and has been drawn from research that has looked at current heads of state in places as different as Germany, New Zealand, and Malawi recently, and so on. So that's just to say that, yes, I completely believe in this, not because I think that women cannot fight, because women fight. And I think it's important to say this. There are women combatants. There are women who support the fighting forces. There are women who volunteer their services for the fighting forces, and their labor must also be accounted for. But in terms of women in government, yes, if we have more of them, there will be less wars and violent conflicts in Africa.
Thank you, Olajumoke. I think everybody on the panel at least would agree. I know I do. Does anybody disagree? Okay, so going off of that, there's another question that I think is an interesting one as well. Perhaps Chantal, sorry, would you like to speak?
No, I was just going to quickly say that it's not to disagree, but it's to add on what my colleague has said, that yes, I do agree, but I also am of the understanding, also coming from my context, that such kind of change, which is more like structural and systemic change in terms of how things could look like if women were in leadership, does not happen overnight, it takes longer. So we also have, that's the first point that I wanted to make, that yes, women being in leadership can contribute to that, but we also have to realize that we're talking about systems that have been established for a long time, and ways of doing things and power dynamics within that system that are predominantly patriarchal in nature. So it cannot happen overnight. It cannot happen in 5 or 10 or 20 years, but eventually having more women in these kind of decision-making positions to some extent can contribute to having peaceful communities. One other last thing that I wanted to add is to also be aware of the African context here in terms of like the political governance structures. Having a woman president in Ethiopia may not mean the same as having a woman president in Rwanda, for example, because of the different political structures, governance structures that we have. Having a big number of women that are more than 50% in parliament in Rwanda, it's great, it means something. But in terms of the power dynamics, it also does not deliver immediately to the things that women in the communities would expect from this change. So we also have to be aware of the other structures that are in place that we still have to battle with and deal with as women in leadership positions. And so, yeah, that's also to that discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, your point is taken completely. It's not to say that having women in power solves all the problems. Like in Ethiopia, as you gave an example, the once Abiy Ahmed came into power, he made the parliament 50-50, half women, half men, and the current prime minister of Ethiopia is a woman, Sahle-Work, and what she did was actually her thing has been advocating for women, and I'm a feminist and things like that. And since the war began, we've only seen her cheer for the war. And when it came to these victims of sexual violence, she went and offered them sanitary towels, as opposed to calling for an end to this entirely. So yeah, I think it's dependent on a lot of factors. Does anybody have anything to add? Sorry.
Yeah, can I quickly say something?
Of course.
Yeah, I think it's to underline what you just said and what Chantal said, all of which I completely agree with, to underline the point that it is having women in executive positions that will make a difference in the short term, not women in parliament. And I think I made that point. So that means having women heads of states, not heads of women heads of governments, not necessarily heads of states, which is the case with Ethiopia currently. You have a female head of state who does not have executive powers, and so that's a different ball game from having an Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the head of state of Liberia, and frankly speaking, who did so much to ensure that the country did not return to conflict after that prolonged war. And that was not an easy labor. at all, because as Chantal put it so well, the interests were very entrenched. This was a society, an entire generation had grown up on this war, and yet it was a woman head of state and a woman president that made sure that almost every day for the first 5 groups and factions that were ready to go back to war. You know, so that's just to say that I think that if women have the right power and are in the right positions, yes, absolutely, we will see a change, and in the short term. And so we must do what Chantal said, which is that as we are advocating for an end for this conflict and other conflicts on the continent, we must look at the more structural causes of conflict and the environment that enables these conflicts to come up, to persist, and to stretch for so long. And that is the more difficult labor that we must address.
Thank you. Yes, for sure. I think following on from that, somebody asked, why do people on our continent, on the African continent, I guess, scream or advocate and amplify the voices of other non-Africans that are suffering, but haven't said anything, for example, about the conflict in Tigray or other things in Africa? Do any of you have any answers to that?
You know, I would say it is, you know, the point that both Chantal and Jumoke raised earlier around colonial legacies and the kind of divisions that you know, that exist across the continent, where our own view and identity of who we are as Africans is formed and shaped a lot by external influences. I think, and I go back to the point I was making about knowledge, right? What we know about each other, what we know about things happening in other places that are far away from us. I happen to work in this field, so I know a lot about, you know, about many places on the continent, not about all. But when I think about some of my younger siblings, you know, the continent is not known to them. The things we know maybe are about, you know, the most popular musician or the most popular artist or actress, if we even get to know about them. And so, and many of the struggles that are external to us, while very important, are also very fashionable, right? So I think there's a lot of work, like I was saying, I go back to the same point, there's a lot of work for young people to do around understanding and knowing the continent, but packaging it in a way that would make sense to, or that is attractive even to, you know, your counterparts in another part of the continent. So it's not for lack of the issue being important, but it's just about who tells the story, how they tell the story, and what language they use to tell the story. And there's a lot of work we have to do to shift that balance, you know, about all our stories across the continent.
Thank you. And in terms of pushing our narrative to be the one that's taken, how, I know you said simplifying it and putting it in a way that would be taken by the youth. How else do you think we can improve in terms of telling our narrative, telling our stories, and having that be the main thing?
I think you know, I think this is also not divorced from history, from having a sense of history. And understanding our identities and where they come from. A lot of what you know, many people know, whether they're younger or older, is really rooted in the way our histories have been told. And there's a question in the chat, I don't know if the person who asked it is still here, Fasika Gebru, has asked about, how the ways that conflicts are narrated to us from a non-African gaze harm us. And I said earlier about this almost obsession with telling the worst about, or the darkest or the most gruesome about what is happening on the continent, to the exclusion of other things. So, for example, how can we take advantage of the active nature of young Africans in the social media space, in the tech space, the innovation that young people are doing, and the ways in which they marry, perhaps, arts and culture and current events, right? So how do we also promote our fellow brother or sister from another country? How do we make them trend, for example? How do we, just equipping ourselves with knowledge about what other young people are doing, but also locating it with a real sense of history, right? About how we came to be where we are, adopting a Pan-African narrative, learning more about the history of our continent, so that we are actually armed with knowledge and information that is useful to this. I see Jumoke's camera's on, so I think maybe she wants to weigh in as well. No?
Please do, Jumoke, if you like.
Well, not really. I think I just agree with you. My camera is on because my internet stabilized. It's once I say it tells me it's unstable, then I put it off. But I think I couldn't agree more with you. And going back to the question about why are we so slow to recognize what our brothers and sisters across the continent are going through? And I think you couldn't have said it better. It is that we must be intentional about seeing them as one of us, as related to us, as their destinies as being connected to ours, historically, contemporarily, and for the future. So with that mindset, I think then I want to know what's happening elsewhere, even though CNN may not immediately make it available, or my local network may not. I will seek that information, and I will then use that information constructively.
And maybe just to add that if we do not occupy these spaces as young Africans, as Africans, other people will occupy them. In my previous role, I used to do a lot of work at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and I always tell people who are disillusioned with our institutions on the continent that, for me, this was one of the institutions that was most welcoming and most accommodating to Africans and Africans in civil society, because it was accessible. You could go to the Gambia, you could go to Banjul, and you could engage with this African institution. Of course, there were people from Western institutions, but what we found and what we were able to do, which goes to my point about solidarity, we were able as young people, or as people working from different African countries, to come together around agendas and ideas and push for these. Many of them were adopted by the Commission, and we see them even existing today. So I think it's knowing and understanding what exists. We need to know as Africans what exists in our continent, and then we need to make it work for us. And we can only do that if we work together. But there's so many ways, I think, that that we can do so much more and make some of these things more accessible, especially for this generation. I think there's just social media and tech has just really lifted the lid so wide on so many things, and really it should be taken advantage of.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, I think that brings us to the last 7 minutes of our event. So I'd like to ask you all to just, if you have any last remarks, to maybe points of action people can take on the topic of our discussion. So African solutions, how we fail women and girls in conflict, and if there are any last things that you'd all like to say. Maybe if I start with you, Shuvai, since you're here, and then we'll move on to Chantel, and then Olajumoke, if that's okay, and then we'll conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will just reiterate my main point especially around knowledge. Read up, know what your continent is about, know what else has been done in relation to similar situations, and build solidarity, create spaces, keep talking, talk to all sorts of people, talk to people who have gone before, people who are having who are in current situations which are similar. Read, engage, create knowledge, share that knowledge. And then someone in the chat is asking, how about changing to an African youth network or African women something? Go for it. Nothing is stopping you. Build that solidarity. And thank you so much for this opportunity and this space. And I look forward to seeing all of you make an impact, not only in Ethiopia, but on the continent.
Me too. I hope that happens for us. Up next, can we have Chantel, if that's okay? Yeah.
I think Chantel. Yeah.
Okay. That's fine. Olajumoke, you can go then if that's okay.
Okay, I see Chantel trying. I think she raised her hand. She's in the other group as an attendee.
I'll let her up.
Oh yes.
I think you're in, Chantal. Sorry. No? Yeah. Perfect.
Hi, thank you so much. I think I don't have much to add in addition to what I had shared earlier. Is to continue having this discussion, is to continue learning more. And one last thing that I really want to finish on is how to find ways and plan about how we can extend the networks around people that are talking about these issues beyond what we have now. In this kind of context and this kind of situation, it's really impossible and hard to keep this kind of conversation amongst small groups. So how do we expand on our networks? It can be pre-existing networks, civil society organizations, but also how do we partner with strong allies that could put in practice or implement some of the things that have already been shared here in terms of how do we get people on our sides, different countries and all that, in terms of not just right now in terms of like pushing for a change right now, but at least to be involved in these kind of discussions and to find how these networks that we create can also contribute in, expanding the networks to bigger, beyond us. That's what I mean. So I think there's strength in the volume of people and in the kind of people that talk about these issues. And we need to leverage on that and work with pre-existing and new and upcoming networks with society or political or different decision makers in different institutions and countries to take this further. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Chantal. Olajumoke, go.
Thank you so much. For me, it's been a privilege to participate in this conversation. And I want to say that I know probably you will have your plans for this, but to be sure that some of the key points from this conversation are widely shared beyond this group on both regular and social media, so that the conversation does not end right now. And I think everyone has said that. And that we must all see ourselves as actors wherever we are, either actors who choose to be silent or actors who are deliberate about the impacts, hopefully positive, that they have. And I want to encourage the Tigray Youth Network, as Shuvai said, to also consider building bridges that will expand this conversation and perhaps even though we could not prevent this particular conflict, perhaps prevent another one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much for attending. And yes, we hope that although this conflict is playing out and it's genocidal and it's awful, we hope conversations like this can prevent rather than mitigate the issues after it having happened. So to conclude, you know, I want to say, let us as Africans have standards for ourselves. Let's have good, high standards for ourselves, for our leaders, for our humanitarians, for our feminists. I don't know if many of you may know that a lot of the Ethiopian feminists have neglected the Tigrayan women on this narrative that this war is justified. We must continue to have discussions like this. We must look inwards into our societies and to our neighbors. We must amplify each other's voices, not just when in pain, but also amplify the good in our society, the talents, the talents and so on. And as somebody mentioned in the chat with the African networks, yes, let's do it. Let's have these networks. Let's have our own solutions for our own people. And yeah, so lastly, we call on you as Tigray Youth Network to share the information about Tigray with your networks and amplify the voices of those who've been silenced, raped, murdered, looted and forced into darkness. We ask you to reach out to us via tigrayyouth.network.org, our website, and we can communicate there and create spaces like this for us to help each other in this. So yeah, this has been African Solutions, How We Fail Women and Girls in Conflict. Thank you all so much for attending and coming and gracing us with all your knowledge and selves. So yeah, I'm going to end it here. Have a lovely, lovely night. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Chantal.
Bye.
Thank you